Good morning. Thank you very much for having me here. And I'm with Marco. I'm not going to Cold Spring Harbor meetings anymore. This is much better. And the skiing is way better. So thank you very much for having me. I want to continue on with what Marco was talking about. And what we're talking about is moving away from just research. So the overview of my talk is a brief background on personalized medicine and the success of whole genome sequencing in a clinical environment. Not for research, but in a clinical environment. I'm going to talk about the need for clinical implementation. Marco started to hit on some of those key points, which is how do you get the physicians to practice medicine with this? Sounds easy, not easy. And why what you do is important. That might sound a little bit odd from an academic, but I hope to convince you that you need to do a lot more selling by the time I'm done with this. And so see what I mean when we go through that. So personalized medicine, this is my favorite definition of personalized medicine. There's many. It's products and services that leverage the science of genomics, proteomics directly, and capitalize on the trends towards wellness and consumerism. Consumerism to enable tailored approaches to the prevention and care. Mind you, in the United States, with the trying to bend the healthcare curve, it will be about you having to pay more of your money and you becoming a consumer. And that is a fundamental change in how patients are going to be looking to you and looking to us to practice medicine. So there was a time when it cost $1 billion in 10 years to sequence the first human genome. There was a time when genetics was a subspecialty. You guys, in some senses, are all geneticists at one level or another, and you will become more and more geneticists as it goes down the road. There was a time when patients were not healthcare consumers, and they are increasingly becoming healthcare consumers, and that is not going to go away, and it scares medicine tremendously, but this is where it's going. And when sequencing machines were for research use only. I know it's still labeled that way, but. So it's a big business, and it's only going to get bigger. These are some estimates that by 2015, which is not so long from now, it can be up to $452 billion. And if you look at the slide, you don't see a lot about the laboratory. It's really about everything else that extends from this information from the laboratory. And it will permeate everything. You're going to hear about ag. You're going to hear about everything. Genomics and digitalization of life is going to be absolutely everywhere we can possibly imagine, and then some. So you're all familiar with genetics. Whether you've studied genetics or not, you all know what this is. This is Down syndrome, trisomy 21. So the only difference between then and now is resolution. There's more and more resolution. There's more and more ability to identify things. And we'll talk some more about that as we go through. So just to remind you, a little bit of biology here. I can't help but being a little professorial for a moment. You get 23 chromosomes from mom, 23 chromosomes from dad. The DNA in every one of your cells is as tall as me, 2 meters. It contains 3.2 billion base pairs from each one of your parents, so 6.4 billion base pairs. And there's about 30,000 genes, except for the Y chromosome, which is largely deficient from genes, which at least half the audience knows that. Now, with this information, what can we do with this? Well, there's a lot of things we can think about it. And one of the things I'm sure you've all wondered is how long is all of the DNA in your body? So we actually can do this math now. And we know that there's 2 meters in every cell, and there's 100 trillion cells, so it's 2 times 10 to the 14th meters, which sounds long. But these are kind of stupid numbers because nobody knows what that means. So how far is it to the sun? Well, that's 1.5 times 10 to the 11th. The finance guys have already done the math in their head, and they've told you right now that it's 1,333 trips to the sun. Now, how many round trips is that? You can all do the math on that. This is my favorite number, 666. 0.5, which might actually explain a lot. Now, while that's a funny statement, let's think about that for a minute. What we're talking about, what Marco was talking about, was going in and reading tumors. A single base pair change in one cell can kill you. So we're talking about moving away from not just sequencing your genome once, but how many times are we going to sequence your genome? How many times are we going to look at RNA-seq? This is the scale we've got to be thinking about when we're going to talk about personalized medicine. Adam and Eve. Was there Adam and Eve? Well, by sequencing, we can now go in and ask those questions. And as it turns out, there's mitochondrial Eve, who lived about 140,000 years ago and came out of Africa. What about Adam? How would we look at that? Well, we look for Y chromosomes. So it turns out that there's Adam. And Adam lived 60,000 years ago. Anybody see a problem with this? Well, first of all, Eve came first. Second of all, there's a few years, 80,000 years between that. And some would argue those were the best 80,000 years of Eve's life. Well, this historical information now suddenly changes how we can think about our genome and what we can do with that information. So personalized medicine, Will Chamberlain, the jockey, oh no, that would be the basketball player, and Willie Shoemaker, the jockey. If there's a point in my career I didn't have to introduce these people. They're both adults. And so this is the problem that we provide our physicians. We give them on average abilities. That's what we give them. Of course, when they see a patient, it is personal. If you've been to an OB-GYN, it's personal. If you've had your prostate checked, it's personal, okay? That's not what I'm talking about. But what I'm talking about is the tools we give our physicians, and here's a silly, stupid example. They're both adults, and they both have a headache. So they go to the medicine cabinet, and it says, adults take 2 aspirin. Will Chamberlain should take 4. And Willie Shoemaker should take a half. And this is how we practice medicine every single day. On average, that medication is safe. Stop your DVR sometime and look at the bottom line on that advertisement. Could cause death. Okay? So, family history, I got to change a slide. Family history is how we practice genetics every day in the clinic. Your family history. How many of you think family history is important? Raise your hand. Yeah. How many of you practice Family History Day? So in the United States, a Surgeon General 10 years ago said, Thanksgiving Day, when we're all together as family, we should discuss our history. So the problem is that in concept, it's great. But in practice, there's a bias in reporting family history. Men have half as many relatives as women. Women get that. Guys are like, how does that work? Because we can't remember our family. My wife is responsible for knowing my family. I don't have any idea what my family is. And shocking as it may seem, men underreport severity. I know, this is shocking. I go to see my physician, Rick Gillis. He goes, Howard, what are you here for? I said, I'm fine. My wife thinks I need a physical. Anything wrong? No, I'm fine. Right? So, if this is how we practice medicine, so here's a true story in my family. I've been studying high blood pressure for 30 years. Being a dork scientist, everybody in my family knows this is what I do. My dad fell off of a ladder a couple years ago, was in an emergency room in Chicago. I drove down there. My mom was going through his history. We get to the hypertension part. Now, of course, I'm checking off as we're going through the history in my head. And we get to high blood pressure. He goes, does Dick have high blood pressure? And she goes, yes. I'm like, what? Well, that must be new. Is he on medication? Yes. And I'm thinking, what? He's on medication? How long has he been on medication? 10 years. I had to bite my finger, right? Do you think anybody would have bothered to tell me that? For 10 years, I've been filling out my family history form, no hypertension. So here's the problem. If we have the right data, family medicine's important. That is your genetics. Your self-reported lack of communication among family members is how we practice genetics. And it's meaningful, if it's right. So I'm going to simply say, genomic sequencing is a quantitative family history that should improve every year. Can you imagine what benefit it will be to your children and your grandchildren if they really knew your family history? That's a game changer. That's a game changer. Well, this just came out in Time. You want to know my future? And people look at this and they're like, oh, this is really science fiction. We're a way away from this. It's not going to happen anytime soon. Except for all these genome-wide association studies are showing that we've mapped a tremendous amount of biology onto the human genome. And if you go in and you take a look at the list, it's almost meaningless to put this up there. There's really important things in here. Endometriosis, as an example. But you go and you look at the editorials. The editorials say the SNPs, it's too small of an effect. They don't have an effect on healthcare, which is true. If you look at it epidemiologically, this is no longer epidemiological science. This is about what does it mean in an individual. Nobody is prepared to know how to do that. Well, one of the great things about this business is the direct-to-consumer genetics, because they're driving a bunch of this stuff. And so they just had a publication that came out recently. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot I was going to talk about PharmGKB. The other thing about all these diseases is drugs. So if you go to PharmGKB, there's 370 drugs that have some type of information about genetics. And some of this is shocking, or at least I hope you're shocked when I show you this. So one of my favorite examples is clopidogrel. Okay, this is a $1,500 a month drug. It's just come off patent, but that's what it was before. It's also called Plavix. 26% of people taking this medication cannot metabolize it to its active form. We do not do genetic testing. It's recommended, but we don't do it. So these people are taking a drug for $1,500 a month that does not work. Puts them at a 50% higher risk for a second heart attack. And we're not testing for it. Morphine, aspirin, a whole bunch of other things. This is all out there. And we're not using this information because we have these debates about whether or not it's meaningful. This is the story I was telling you about. This is the paper just came out. Shocking. Having SNP data, genetic markers, and self-reported family history is better than self-reported family history alone. That shouldn't be shocking at all. Why aren't we doing more of this? Well, this is what I've been told over and over and over again about genomic sequencing. It will be a long time before it's used clinically, and no one's going to pay for it. So here's a fact. Genetic testing for diagnosis and drugs is largely not used and often excluded from insurance plans. So we say, well, let's not do it. So on June 27th, 2009, I got this email from Alan Mayer, who is a pediatrician, GI, who said, and this is June 27th, briefly, XXX, that's Nick, a 4-year-old boy with a very unusual malignant form of inflammatory bowel disease and profoundly delayed wound healing, life-threatening loss of weight, so on and so forth, has been in the hospital since January. This is June. So Nick was dying. Could you read his genome and see what's wrong? So we decided we'd do that at that point in time. It was $75,000 to do an exome. We did an exome sequencing on this, and we went and we found the variant. This is what Nick looked like. So that's not after surgery up there. That is his wound. That was because of his genetic defect. And it turns out he had a gene in XIAP. We could show evolutionarily that Nick and his mom, because it's on the X chromosome, are the only two still to this day on the planet that have this variation. So evolution becomes our friend. We can now use that as a way to say this. And we could model it. We could show that it was dysfunctional. So we showed this. We took it to our physician team, and Dave Margolis, the discussion about doing a cord blood transplant, said, I'm not doing it. There's a 46% chance that he'll die by doing the cord blood transplant. There's no evidence that this fits in the gut. I will not do the bone marrow transplant. Prove to me that this is related to gut disease. So we sat on this for almost 2 months. We didn't know what to do with this. We thought we had it, but no one's going to practice medicine with it. And along came a paper from an Italian group that actually showed that XIAP links into a gene pathway for NOD signaling. And NOD signaling is known to be involved in gut. And at that point, Dave Margolis said, I will do the transplant. But there's other physicians out there that wouldn't have done that. As Marco said, this is hard. How do you get somebody to do this? There's no published literature on this. You know this whole notion of evidence-based medicine? Where's the evidence? Where is the evidence? So these are the key points that have to be pulled into place to think about that. So at the end of the day, Nick had not eaten or drank for 9 months. A cord blood transplant was decided to happen, and this is what happened. So he remains very well. This is a picture of Nick 2.5 years later. He's had no gut disease. And this was picked up with the media. There's a lot of attention. And what ended up happening is it's basically become a poster child around all of this. This is the paper that we published. We had a very tough time publishing this. It took us 7 different journals to get this in because nobody publishes an N of 1. And we're the Medical College of Wisconsin. So if you want to fall asleep, read this article. If you want to read the Pulitzer Prize story called 1 in a Billion by these 2 reporters that ended up getting embedded in this process, which is a whole other story, which if you're interested, I can tell you that story. It's a really great article. It tells you a lot about that. So we then ended up building a clinical team. So we have a fully functional clinical operation now where we do whole genome sequencing, and these are the components that go into it. There's ethics teams, there's phenotyping, there's all this assessment that goes into this, and suddenly it goes from being just a simple individual sport to a team sport. But keep in mind, when the physician's with the patient, it's mano a mano. That physician has got to know they want to do this. And that's a really, really important. That's a really hard thing. Every physician makes decisions a little bit hard, a little bit differently. How do you come up with an analysis that enables them to know this? Well, so we've had a lot of successes around this. This just came out in Parents Magazine this week, where the Medical College of Wisconsin's Children's Hospital was ranked number 4. And in this story, they talk about a mother and the daughter, where we've ended up doing whole genome sequencing. She went to place to place to place and didn't find an answer. And we did the whole genome sequencing, and we've discovered what causes this disease. But we can't treat it. So in the medical profession, we talk about actionability. That's largely, I'm going to say, arrogance on our part. What can we do to help you? But I'm going to tell you, every day we tell you things that you don't want to know about, that we can't do much about it. Obesity, high blood pressure, cancer, diabetes. None of these things we can cure. Genetics is no different. But that information has potential value beyond what we think of as practicing medicine. And I'll give you a very difficult example, but a true example around this. So case MTD, full-term infant, born 38 weeks, no complications during pregnancy or delivery, 4 days noted to have some symptoms of lethargy, hypotonic, hypoglycemic, hypothermic, diagnosed with transient hyperammonium of the newborn. It's rare, but not that rare. Started on amniol and arginine, resulted in a rapid decrease in ammonia levels, and the child was discharged. At 2 months, had a well check. Everything looked good. 10 weeks, rushed to the ER and started to spiral downhill from there. Significant dyspnea, a swollen liver. Seizure activity was also suspected. Liver biopsy showed that the liver was failing. The mitochondria, which is a common cause of liver disease in children, seemed to be, it was subnormal, but it was functioning normal, and the variations that were known weren't there. Activity, although it wasn't quite right, seemed to be okay. So should we do a liver transplant? Well, the physician team was a little bit worried about some of the neurological behavior, and we ended up in this case doing a whole bunch of genes, a bunch of gene panels, and what we found was actually that this child had a twinkle mutation, which sounds really nice. It's a new variation in twinkle. No one had ever reported this before. But twinkle kills you neurologically. So the child's going to die from a neurological disease. Do we do a liver transplant? Who gets to make that decision? So the child died at 6 months of age because the parents and the clinical team decided not to have the transplant. The child was able to be in comfort, didn't go through a futile surgery. These are not small issues doing a liver transplant. And the liver went to another child. Here's the key. The parents knew it wasn't their fault. They stopped worrying. They could now start dealing with that. I'm going to tell you that's actionable. Same as in the other case where we could make a diagnosis. That's actionable. And we need to think about it, particularly as we move to people having access to more and more and more information. So, because of the Nick Volker story, Sarah Holt from Nova approached us, and they wanted to follow a case from the very beginning, and they did a feature on this. I said, you don't want to do this because we're going to fail. So we successfully failed on national television to find what was wrong with Andrew. The great thing for the show, I just heard from her that Science, the AAAS, just gave them a film award, so it's going to be back out again, and they're going to talk about this. But we're still chasing what's wrong with Andrew. And I'll tell you, for medical genetics, generally, we make a diagnosis about 10% of the time. With whole genome sequencing, we're at 34%, and we could do better. The problem is there's not enough genomes. We need more genomes. I've also been told this over and over and over again. No company will pay for this anytime soon. You go out and take a look at this from United Health and Aetna and these other groups. They're talking about farewell to fee for service. So why would a physician want to get involved in this? They're trying to figure out how to maintain what they're getting paid for. So there's challenges on this. What's the economics? Truth? No one knows. Concern? It's going to be like MRI. You're going to get all these secondary effects that come on board. You're going to actually increase your diagnostic costs by doing whole genome sequencing. Preventative medicine is a money loser. Doesn't mean it's not better medicine, but it's a money loser. So what's the evidence? Why should we do this? Well, almost 2 years ago, we got a letter from the insurance group that said, basically, as we have discussed in situations where you determine on average the cost of routine testing will exceed the current contract price for whole genome sequencing, we will authorize whole genome sequencing as a first-line clinical test. So in 12 test cases, how many do you think were paid for? 12? 0? Perfect. You've bracketed it for me, so you're both right. If we go to the average, 6. I think that's pretty amazing. And people say, well, how do you get this done? It's simple. We go to them and we say, we will nickel and dime you one gene at a time until you have to come and do the whole genome. And if you just would have done it in the first place, it would have been cheaper. It's not about efficacy. It's not about the evidence. It's about the finances, right? So it's doable. But genomics medicine is way more than sequencing. We're really in an age where we're digitalizing a whole bunch of things. These are all the different pieces that have to come together. How do you integrate this information? How do you pull these pieces together? How do you deliver 6.4 billion data points to a physician who has 7.5-minute contact time? Well, let's think about medical history for a few minutes. What's this? Blood pressure cuff. How many of you have had one of these? Please, everybody raise your hand. Is this good medicine? We prescribe billions of dollars of medications on this every year. It's a balloon. We blow it up on your arm. We shut off your blood flow. Somebody listens, whether it's a machine or a human, that says, oh, the blood's come back. But it has predictive entities, right? So there were some points in times where you would have been burned at the stake for being a witch, for being able to predict a stroke. All right? What's this? An EKG. Is this good medicine? Yeah, it's pretty good. It's 13 wires that sticks on your body. Do we make mistakes on this? Every day. So what's the difference between a blood pressure cuff, an EKG, and sequence? We simply accept and know how to use the other two. And we worry. We worry, oh my gosh, what are we going to do about incidental findings? Who should control that? That's personal. They're your findings. What are you going to do with them? How do we deal with it? We just had a case, a cancer case, came in. We're probably not going to save this woman's life, but she has Marfans on top of it. We found in her family carriers of Marfan syndrome. It's not a bad outcome for the family. So, do you want your genome sequenced? Come on, you're a sequencing company. How many of you would like to have your genome sequenced? Yeah, now I just violated a very important thing, right? So in a clinical study, we have to worry about how do people feel about doing this. What if you actually don't want your genome sequenced and you work for a sequencing company? Well, you guys have instituted a program called Understand Your Genome, and I am happily one of the participants of that. I paid for it myself because people always ask me, have you had your genome sequenced? So I went through my genetic counselors and went through the whole thing, and I had to ask some fundamental questions. What do my daughters want to know? I have a 16-year-old and 18-year-old, and breast cancer runs in my family. What do they want to know? Because I know me. They don't want to know. I'm going to end up being able to, I'm going to end up being able to say, Shelby, who's a freshman in college, did you get a mammogram? If she doesn't want to know, right? I'll have a different conversation with her boyfriend, even though I don't like him, right? Thank you. So all of a sudden, then, this changes. And should we be helping you practice medicine on you? So here's my genome. So if we could pull that up. So here's my genome. Jay and I share a biotinidate deficiency together. So these are all my variants. So, breast cancer's in my family. Let's get really personal for a minute. Oh, and by the way, my genome's more interesting than your genome, at least to me. So here's breast cancer. So let's pull up a BRCA2. So this is pulling it up. So what we can see is that the clinical team at Illumina came up with these little dots that says, hey, these are important, and they're in genes for BRCA2. But we don't know what they mean. It looks like they're okay. So you can feel kind of warm and fuzzy about that, or I can feel kind of warm and fuzzy about that. But if I go in and I start looking at some detail about this, you see every one of those little purple? That's where I'm different from the reference. Are they meaningful or not? I don't know. But this is incredibly personal because it matters to my family. And in fact, the world's changing. I was saying to Jay last night, every time he and I take a medication or something happens and we survive, there's variations in our genome show us that it's not a problem. What if we all had our genome sequenced? Every time something happens to you medically with your variation, we suddenly change the paradigm. That's a game changer. That's a fundamental change in how we think about doing this. And I think your whole Understand Your Genome project's a clever way of getting out there. Because as people start walking around saying, hey, you want to see my genome? It starts conversations. Puts people to sleep, but okay, that's a different story. Anyway, so if we can go back to the slides, and if you want to know more about my genome, I'll show you my genome later. So, in summary, the Medical College of Wisconsin, our affiliated hospitals, okay, we're bragging a little bit, are the world's leaders in personalized medicine. We are practicing medicine with this today. It's not a pilot project. We're practicing medicine with this today. Our goal is to lead in clinical implementation. There's plenty of really, really good groups, Marco's group and others out there who are doing incredible research. There's a lot of stuff we can do today to practice medicine with this, and I've just shown you some of that, so we want to be able to do that. There's a revolution in medicine coming that will be driven by having a patient's genomic sequence and digitalization. I'm walking around with my iPad. I tell you, I was just at a Keystone meeting with David Bentley, and every time the cardiovascular things came up, I typed in the RS number. Sadly, I didn't capture it, but I was looking at all these variants, you know? We could finally bend the healthcare curve. You, as the consumer, has the opportunity to think about that. There are many, many, many economic opportunities here. It's fundamental to think about that. There's nothing wrong with that. If we don't commercialize this stuff, we don't get it out there, we don't practice medicine with it. Public-private partnerships are important. We need to be thinking about that. That's why we're here. That's why others are here. It's important that you think about that when you're talking with your customers and your clients and looking at this. So here's Nick. This is Nick's 8th birthday in October. He's doing really well. Here's Andrew. I think we finally found it, but we're having a huge argument with our clinical team because it's not what they thought it was going to be. How do we prove that? And this is Avery. And this one troubles me. So Avery's 4 now. She's had problems her whole life. Clinical picture, didn't know what was wrong with her. Long story short, we finally did a whole genome sequencing on her. It's treatable. So we've stopped the neurological decay now, but she'll never be normal. Nobody made a mistake. The phenotype didn't present the way it should have been. So I'm going to finish. To help more people, we need more genome sequenced. That's your job. You have the technology, you have the capability, you have the sales team, you have passion, you have commitment. Every genome you sell and every genome that gets done helps my kids. You're changing the practice of medicine. If you could hit the $1,000 target, this would be everywhere. How do you get there? No more Averys. If she had been sequenced the day she was born, she'd be normal. Thank you for your attention.